think CO2 equals global warming. It's like so easy to see that that's not the case.
No, that's the shall we say, globalist hoax. I can tell you a little bit about how that all came about. There was a man from Canada, from Winnipeg, named Maurice Strong, and he worked his way up to Power Corporation in Montreal, and from there he got himself into the United Nations as the assistant secretary to Kofi Annan. So he was number 2 man, and he was the one that pulled the levers there in the UN. And so he called a conference in New York of 300 scientists, and says, we want to know whether what's causing this global warming. And so I knew one of the people that went, and so they deliberated there for a couple months, and they wrote what we call a white paper, and they said that there is no evidence that global warming is man-caused. So Maurice Strong, who was a communist, matter of fact, his aunt was the Tokyo Rose of China, telling people in China that all the Americans were dying from hunger, and bad mouthing on China news all the time. Matter of fact, they even made her a monument on Tiananmen Square, and because she was such a, shall we say, great propagandist for the Communist Party. Well, anyhow, that was his aunt, Maurice Strong's aunt, and he became a partner in the Chery automobile manufacturing plants in China. And their idea was to take over the automobile manufacturing for the world, and cheap labor, of course. And so they had to put everybody else out of business so they could get the business. So they took this white paper that said there was no evidence and took the no out of it, and then called the Kyoto Conference. And that was the first conference on global warming.
Wow.
And he presented this paper, which was a fraud, and got this whole thing started. You notice when they did this, they exempted China and India from the restrictions on CO2 production. All the rest of the world, they were restricted. This annoyed the Russians. So when they had the Stockholm conference, the Russians did their homework and hacked in and found that these, well, by the way, the Kyoto conference, they had a resolution that they hire 3,000 scientists to prove that this was true. And so they went around and found some, shall we say, scientists that were starving, and got them to make computer models that, like what Al Gore showed. And these computer models were based on false data, and the Russians proved that at the Stockholm conference. That's why the whole thing collapsed and they moved on, because the Russians showed that they were eliminating any data that showed that there was global cooling, so that it actually made fraudulent results. So that was the 3,000 scientists that supposedly did this. So this is how we got into where we are now. Now, why did the communists want it? It's obvious. They wanted to increase their manufacturing ability in China. They're building 5 coal-fired electrical generating plants every week, 5 a week. So they're dumping huge amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere. And unfortunately, their coal has a lot of mercury in it. So when it gets burnt, we're dumping a huge amount of mercury into the atmosphere to the point where the fish on the Pacific side of the Sierra Nevadas, which is the mountain range against the Pacific Ocean, which is where we catch the weather coming from China, and is so toxic with mercury that they've even put warnings out not to eat the trout fish there because they're so mercury toxic. And so all of those fish in sea creatures in the on the west coast here are getting polluted with mercury and becoming toxic. So that's one of the reasons why we don't want to eat tuna, because they eat the little fish, and so they're collectors of mercury and become concentrators. And tuna fish then is very high in mercury content. So is swordfish. Salmon are good, and trout caught here are not good. So you want to get your salmon from Alaska, preferably.
There's so much good stuff there. I took like an essay worth of notes, but I love it. It's great. Yeah, I'm a big fan of ruminant animals, primarily like grass-fed beef and bison and elk and venison. I think those are generally safer than seafood and have a lot of benefits. But um, yeah, it's funny. I worked at Blockbuster Video when An Inconvenient Truth came out, that Al Gore documentary. And this was before I knew anything about really anything. And I didn't even buy it. I was like, this just looks fake. It looks like it was made up, and I remember the marketing campaign behind that movie. And it's kind of scary because a lot of these social movements, from what I found, like the vegetable oil industry, Monsanto, all of these industries kind of steer public opinion, and sometimes it lasts for half a century, right? And people get so emotional and emotionally charged, but they don't know that their movement was started by a giant corporation.
That's right, or a communist.